Okay, Americans, we are getting into midterm season, and I will be reading some books written by political figures. First one we have this year is Unfettered by John Fetterman. I do already, of course, have Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance and The Art of the Deal by Donald Trump. I've been following Fett's career since 2016, and I haven't always known how to make heads or tails of him. I think a lot of people haven't really known that, and given where he is now with astoundingly low approval in his own party, and him being a senator that gets a unique amount of attention from the media, I think it is worth taking a closer look at something this guy read in order to try and get a good idea of how his mind ticks. So we'll dive right into it. I took notes chapter by chapter. I did listen to the audiobook of this. I suspect but have no proof that this book might have been written at least partially by a ghostwriter. It says on the cover that this book was narrated by the author. However, only 2 chapters were. That would be the prologue and the epilogue. The rest were narrated by someone else. And the reason is pretty clear when you get to the prologue. The preface and the author's note talk about the importance of being aware of your mental health and seeking help when you need it. And then the prologue, and you hear his voice himself. You can hear that he pretty obviously still struggles with speech after the stroke, which is kinda sad more than anything. No matter who it is, when something like that happens to someone, the proper thing to do is to have some sympathy. As for the content of the prologue, it's pretty much a brief overview of the narrative as a whole. Starts by talking about his hometown of Braddock, which can be described as a quintessential Rust Belt town. Was a huge place when the steel industry was big more than 100 years ago, but since then, like a lot of places in the Rust Belt, after the main economic product just plummeted in significance, it turned into a place with boarded up shop windows and graffiti. He also talks about his descent into depression, which happened during and after his stroke on the campaign trail, and during his first few months in the Senate. Describes it being hard to get out of bed or get off the couch. Briefly covers a play-by-play of how the Shorts Act went down from his point of view. So the prologue could be like a little microcosm of the whole book. Chapter 1, again like the prologue, starts a little bit unfocused. There's a brief overview of his life. He talks a little more about the Shorts controversy. Then he skips back to the beginning where he got bullied as a kid. He describes as a kid seeing a field with monarch butterflies, from which this chapter gets its name, and I think the reader is meant to draw the comparison between Fetterman himself and a monarch butterfly, someone who comes out of a chrysalis transformed. Fetterman describes finding football as a sport in high school, working out, getting buff, getting strong enough until he stops getting bullied, finishing high school and then going to Albright College in Reading, Pennsylvania. Still playing football there, however, he is not very good and the team is not very good. A bit of trivia, he says he is the 2nd tallest U.S. senator in history, talks about all the ways he felt awkward during high school, the reasons he got bullied, and also talks about being born when his parents were age 19. Describes carrying guilt over his being unplanned. He feels like he held his parents back from their dreams and their other plans. Which brings us around again to touching on the Shorts Act in the Senate. Almost like a lot of that was giving us background for why he wears shorts in a government office. Tells us his dress code is a way to identify with the working class. I will get to that shortly. Also feels self-conscious and awkward because of his height. It's harder for him to find fitting clothes than the average person, which, okay, I get that. But also describes how the media attention around the Shorts themselves started up from what he describes as a graveyard shift Congress session. It's the type of session where congressmen are more focused on getting done and getting home. The atmosphere is less professional, less serious. So one of the senators wearing shorts there would be less out of place at that time than it would be in a normal Congress session. But Twitter did not know that. The photo of him in shorts in Congress got spread around, blown out of proportion as he puts it, and so began the drama over congressional dress code and decorum, and an act of the Senate trying to create rules around some kind of dress code being named the Shorts Act. As for me myself, I don't really care how they dress. Now, as for his mindset and what he sees as his purpose in Congress, he does give us that directly. He cares about the dramatic rise of the income gap. If you've seen people talk about the top 1% or the top 0.1%, that would be where he says his mindset is. Quote, "It is the only reason I am here as an elected official, to let people know they have an authentic advocate." End quote. And he goes into a little bit of the history of that. He credits unions with keeping the income gap low between 1947 and 1980. Quote, "Since then, the gap between rich and poor has widened exponentially. CEO pay went from 30 times the pay of the average wage earner in 2007 to 350 times in 2019. End quote. Names Bezos, Gates, and Buffett directly. Also, as far as keeping wages low, he credits a lack of foreign competition during the time that he mentioned. And indeed, in the Senate, he has broken with his party and had at least some positive things to say about the Trump tariffs. Quote, "I still live in a forgotten America," end quote. Uses that as a transition point to talk about how the Civil Rights Act was a bipartisan legislation. And he leaves us with a challenge: want to make America great again? Start crossing the aisle. And that's a nice place for him to go back to the beginning of his life, with less skipping around this time, and give us a more linear and comprehensive overview of his time in this world. And of course, the very beginning, quote, "I know my parents wanted me. Their love and support has been profound, but I cannot shake that guilt. When your self-image is being depleted, perception becomes reality, or at least your reality. When your self-image is negative, as mine was growing up, you gravitate towards shame. You gravitate towards feeling unwanted. These feelings become the building blocks for depression," end quote. Quote, "I need to let go of what my birth did to my parents, but I am not good at letting go of anything," end quote. He describes being lonely and awkward in middle school, describes a lot of bullying. His family moved before high school, and then he had a growth spurt and got very, very tall. There was no more bullying, but he still didn't fit in. Quote, "I didn't have enough friends to get into trouble. I studied just enough to get mediocre grades and didn't find anything to latch on to. I was just an anonymous kid in the sea of anonymity that high school can be, until I found football when I was a junior," end quote. He was inexperienced at doing any sport. He got beat up playing football, but he doubled down on it. He worked out, he started feeling the team camaraderie, and he became the most improved player on the team. Graduates high school, goes to Albright, plays football there. Quote, "What I lacked in skill, I made up for in determination," end quote. Quote, "I learned to play through pain. An invaluable lesson for when I got into politics," end quote. Which brings us to chapter 2, titled The Lottery of Birth. And he does skip around again in giving us the story of his life. All these transitions in time feel a lot more smooth when you're actually reading the book than when you're listening to a summary of it. In chapter 2, we see him, after having gotten 2 master's degrees, living in an unheated church basement. Quote, "I didn't mind at all. The place has a Fight Club feel to it, which I like," end quote. He describes ice in the toilet in the morning. Quote, "Did I ever think I would end up in Braddock? No. Am I happy to be there? What is happiness?" End quote. He describes Braddock as a boarded-up town with plywood on the windows and graffiti on the plywood. His parents are worried about his safety with where he's staying. He witnesses a shooting, and his parents dedicate some time to helping him fix up that abandoned church. Quote, "Why would he not care about the simplest creature comforts? Why would he take a step backward like that? On one level, the answer is simple. I thought it was important to live in the community among the students I was serving. The move was also part of a longer road I was on. In truth, I had already traveled many miles before I got to Braddock," end quote. From there, he talks about a friend of his who was killed by a driver who had fallen asleep in the car. This was someone he knew from the University of Connecticut when he was getting his master's degree, and makes the point that life and death are very sudden. Quote, "Prior to Eric's death, I had never considered a career in public service or social work, but when Eric died, it became clear that so much of what happens to you is a function of luck and arbitrariness, with outcomes determined in a matter of seconds." End quote. Quote, "You think you can dictate the circumstances, but the only thing you can do is take the circumstances you have been given and do something with them. There is no reason Eric died when he did, no plausible explanation. He, of course, had no idea how he changed my life." End quote. After college, he worked in Connecticut doing, I believe, if I recall right, he said it was an insurance job. How's that for a parallel Fight Club? But the job left him feeling bored and unfulfilled. Quote, "The growing desire to help others had stuck with me," end quote. And that desire led him to doing the Big Brothers Big Sisters program. And if you haven't heard of that, it's a program where you get the opportunity to act as a role model for a kid. Not an orphan, but a kid who's in a position where they might need a role model. The person Fetterman gets assigned to, however, is an orphan. Both of his parents died of AIDS, which makes John feel lucky by contrast. He has both his parents. He starts talking about the random lottery of birth in the book. The kid that he became a big brother to, his name is Nicky. He met Nicky before his mom died, and he promised Nicky's mom that he would take care of the kids, which he did. He saw Nicky through college. Quote, "He also spurred me to see my employment in a different light. I quit. I wasn't creating anything of value there except for myself. I didn't have another job lined up. My father thought I was nuts." End quote. And now we come to chapter 3, Shot and a Beer. Fetterman starts by going over the history of the steel industry. Immigrants mostly worked 12-hour days in uncomfortable and unsafe conditions. Quote, too many of us think that the poor are lazy and deserve to be poor. We use workers until we no longer need them, then we spit them out. End quote. Quote, it is a tragic fact of life that industrial companies, with rare exception, dislike the men and women that work for them. They see them as burdensome but necessary evils who demand this and demand that and then run to the unions for protection because they have the temerity to think they deserve good pay. End quote. Gives a few proletarian talking points that made more sense 100 years ago than they do today. Talks about how big industry is incentivized to squeeze the most value for the least cost from its workers. Talks about how the COVID pandemic caused manufacturing jobs to plummet in America, and talks about how AI will soon replace even more factory jobs. By contrast, steel at the turn of the 20th century built Pennsylvania. It was an industry that produced something concrete and physical rather than just fluff jobs. He goes over the history of labor strikes and scabs, workplace deaths, riots, and describes workplace conditions that kind of force me to admit that during this time and place in history, the left does indeed have a point with their union narrative. Fetterman describes workers using alcoholism to cope with the long days and the tough working conditions. The 1920s and 30s were a good time for the town of Braddock. Quote, wages went up, safety conditions improved, the 8-hour workday was finally introduced, and the steelworkers had some disposable income, end quote. There was a population boom in that town, a commercial boom. It was a company town that grew into somewhat of a tourist economy shopping district. And for immigrant workers, this was the American dream. And this part did make me think back to J.D. Vance's book Hillbilly Elegy, where he talks about a place not too far away from Braddock in the Rust Belt, another place where the steel mill built the town. And the way J.D. talks about it was that the workers felt like they owed something to the company, just for how much the steel mill did for the local economy. That's at least the feel I got from it. And the other thing, as long as we're stopping and commenting, is that, of course, as a former mayor of Braddock, Fetterman would know the history very well. But continuing with the narrative and the history of the town, after World War II, American steel got outcompeted by foreign steel companies, and the town gradually went into boarded-up window mode. Flash forward several decades, and here is John Fetterman. Quote, Braddock was always going to be the perfect place for me. It's funny how life has a way of getting you where you need to be, even if you didn't know it. End quote. So, 1994, this is after he quit his job without a plan for where to go next. He takes a trip to the West Coast to get his mind in order, and then he goes to UPitt, studies social work and public policy. Before deciding that this is not the right time in his life for school, he wants action. So he joins AmeriCorps. Later on, he would study public policy at Harvard as well, and then after Harvard, he ends up in Braddock, doing another charity project. With 2 master's degrees, he certainly could have had a cushier job and lived in a more comfortable place, which begs the question, why would he tolerate the cold showers and a church basement in Braddock, in a town where 90% of the population had picked up and left? And also gives us a very good hook for the book. Quote, I did not consider the ashes of Braddock blight. I saw instead what I called malignant beauty, powerful remnants of what had once been here. I was intrigued by the idea of actually making change and trying to reverse years of abandonment in the industrial grid, end quote. And so he puts what he learned at Harvard to good use, and starts trying to see what good he can do in that town. Which brings us to chapter 4, titled Left to Die, where he talks about the tattoos on his arm, which before this book I had heard half the story at least. The tattoos are dates of people's deaths during a specific murder spree in the town of Braddock during the time when he was mayor. He describes a couple cases. One was a delivery guy that was killed. It was a seemingly random murder. It was a failed robbery because the killer fled the scene before he even grabbed the wallet, and that delivery guy was age 36. Also talks about a missing toddler case, or at least it started as a missing toddler case. The parents reported the child missing. It turns out, as we later find out, the father had decided to do a rape murder and hide the body. And after they found the body later, they figured out what happened. And the delivery driver murder, as a matter of fact, happened 2 weeks into his term as mayor. He won that mayor election as a result of too many candidates in the primary election. His vote total was 149, that was in 2006. He describes city council as being pretty complacent. Meanwhile, Fetterman is interested in getting moving. Talks about building community centers using donation money from nonprofit groups that he had worked with in the past. He talks about being the token white carpetbagging mayor of a predominantly black community. And the other takeaway from this chapter is that he was deeply affected by the murders and some of the stuff he saw firsthand. He describes taking the law enforcement part of his job as mayor pretty seriously, responding to calls and events even at odd hours, which led him to see some stuff that stuck with him. Which leads us to chapter 5, titled The Wife's Tale, written by Giselle, his wife. Briefly, her life story: she was born in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Her family fled the crime of that place and came to New York City when she was age 7. Her mom worked doing cleaning. The family moved to New Jersey eventually. She started working at age 13. And as the family was undocumented, she describes growing up with no health insurance and fear of getting health treatment because of the legal status. So there were a couple times where she probably should have gone to the doctor, but she didn't, just fixed it at home. Worked hard, got good grades in school, but was unable to get a lot of scholarships because of that status. At the age of 19, she bought a house in Newark, New Jersey. She is also a nonprofit worker at heart, specializing in nutrition. And just by coincidence, the town of Braddock popped up in more than one place from more than one source, caught her attention, having a little bit of a superstitious Latin American streak. She sees it as a sign and contacts the mayor of the town, asking to go and visit, and then the mayor calls her back and invites her to come. And then one visit turns into more than one visit with this man. You can guess where this is going. Quote, "My first impression of Braddock was like my first impression of John. A core of goodness and potential, if you could dig beneath the layers of neglect." End quote. Quote, "I had never seen a ghost town before. Coming from a developing country, I had found myself in a country of disposability, which was embodied by Braddock. The borough was depopulated, basically empty, and I know now that Braddock is part of an American trend of discarding and never thinking to rejuvenate until it is too late." End quote. In 2004, at the age of 22, she got the green card. In 2008, when she was 26 and John Fetterman was 39, they have 13 years between them, that is when they got married. After that, she did food pantry type work in Braddock, then came the honeymoon, then came children, and she describes a fast pace in their life, feeling like time just came slipping by until John's political career developed more. So all of a sudden, in the blink of an eye, they have 3 kids, and John Fetterman is depressed after his Senate race, which is a good opportunity for her to talk about how her husband is trying to pave the way for mental health destigmatization, specifically for politicians. Chapter 6, The Last Laugh, starts by talking about how Giselle doesn't really like politics and doesn't really want to be involved, which kind of fits the impression I had because she seems to be less visible than other politicians' wives that I can think of off the top of my head. Quote, "It's not a sacrifice I wanted to make," end quote. Quote, "This is the medium he found to do good. This was the conduit to do good, and it just happened to be through politics," end quote. That last quote in particular, I want to stick a pin in that. I will make the case throughout this book that John Fetterman is more of a non-profit worker than he is a politician at heart. So flash forward to the Senate. John describes a sad, windowless office for a junior senator, disillusionment with his time in D.C., doesn't fit in with the culture, and this leads him to clinical depression. Which leads us to ask, why did he go into politics? Well, remember, we are seeing this story through the eyes of a politician who obviously wants votes. With that in mind, politics are, like Giselle said, his conduit for helping people. Now, skipping in time again to the 2016 election, this is the time when I myself became aware of John Fetterman. Now, as far as I myself go, me, the person putting together this book review, I was in college at the time, in my early 20s. I think I was exactly 20 years old, in fact. So this was my first time voting in a presidential election. This was, of course, the election where Donald Trump got elected. And being in college, I was surrounded by college kid Bernie Sanders voters. I had not looked into politics at the time. I mostly blindly followed what my friends were doing. And my friends were downright socialists. Everyone was excited for Bernie Sanders. He was the only non-racist option, at least if everyone at my college could be believed. And by an extension of that, the Bernie Sanders endorsed candidate for 2016 Senate in Pennsylvania was a tall, biker-looking dude by the name of John Fetterman. He was the mayor of some town out west. I was in the eastern half of the state, and people were excited that a tall, tough-looking dude, at least if the election went our way, was going to go to the U.S. Senate, tower over everyone around him, and intimidate the other senators into seeing that socialism is good for everyone. So that is where I was at this time. The election itself, of course, was more complex than that. Fetterman describes it as being just too early for issues like weed legalization, same-sex marriage, and $15 minimum wage. I'm gonna call bull on all three of these. Colorado had legalized weed several years before. I think pretty consistently it's been more than a 50-50 issue, people in favor of legalization, and I get the impression that we're just waiting for legislation to actually catch up to the will of the people. As for same-sex marriage, at the time it was more like a 70-30 issue, people celebrating that Supreme Court decision during the Obama years. And as for $15 minimum wage, I remember as a point of fact that the Hillary Clinton door knockers were getting paid $15 an hour to go knock on doors. So I don't think John Fetterman's issue in the 2016 election was any of those three policy points. I think it's more that the neoliberals have a big club and you're not in it. But I digress. Fetterman talks about two people who worked closely with him on that campaign, Pat Milham and Rebecca Katz. Braddock, he says, was too small for him to get much notice, but Rebecca Katz, who's a political consultant who has worked on bigger campaigns than this, believes in Fetterman and she helps him out. Their goal was to go for the left-wing progressive vote, which, speaking as someone on the ground, yeah, good strategy. Or let me rephrase that, if not a good strategy, they at least succeeded in their goal. DNC Convention Day at my college, and on the social media circles where my college friends hung out, was not a happy day because all us college kids were in denial about both Bernie Sanders and John Fetterman losing that primary. Yay, superdelegates. But Rebecca Katz, however briefly she's quoted in this book, seems to understand this better than Fetterman, who wrote that weed and $15 minimum wage was the reason he lost. Quote, "They don't like what they don't know," end quote, referring to Washington, D.C. culture. Fetterman talks about earlier in the campaign, he wanted the Bernie Sanders endorsement as part of that goal of going for the left-wing progressive vote. Quote, "Although I never shared his support for socialism, I believed he was exactly right in identifying that something was wrong in the political machine," end quote. Describes the Bernie Sanders staff as being a little bit rude and self-righteous, but in the end they did get that endorsement, and the primary result was they got 20% of the vote with no TV ads, and they even won Allegheny County, that includes the city of Pittsburgh, which is the second largest city in Pennsylvania. So despite losing the primary, in the context of the campaign being what it was, which was a long shot by the best of terms, he ended up getting some pretty significant milestones. And now we come to Chapter 7, Pardon Me. And I think this chapter is where we get to see who Fetterman is as a politician, more so than his time as mayor. He describes meeting Josh Shapiro in 2008, when they were both electors for Barack Obama. Shapiro was elected AG in 2016, and curiously, Shapiro did not support the neoliberal candidate for that election, so it seemed at the time that he and Fetterman had some things in common. In 2017, this was after Fetterman's Senate run. He ran for lieutenant governor, going after a vulnerable seat. He did win the election, Tom Wolf was governor at the time, and as lieutenant governor, one of his duties was to chair the Board of Pardons, which Josh Shapiro was also on the Board of Pardons. And this is where, as Fetterman tells the story, the differences between him and Shapiro came to a head pretty often. Because the Board of Pardons carries some political risk to it. Because if somebody that you granted a pardon or a sentence commutation goes out and later recommits a crime, commits some bloody and infamous felony, then the very next time election season comes around for you, that criminal's name will come up. Your opponent will wave it in your face. Hey, this is the guy who lets dangerous people back on the streets. Fetterman gives direct examples of when this has happened before to other people. Quote, "I truly believe with all my heart that no one I supported for a pardon was a danger to society, and I was willing to stake my political career on it. Shapiro was far more cautious. And at a certain point I began to think that what was motivating him was not a sense of caution, but political ambition," end quote. Knowing what I know of Josh Shapiro, I do not doubt that for a second. Fetterman goes on to point out one thing that he thinks is unfair in the justice system. Felony murder, as it is on the books in Pennsylvania. For that particular crime, you do not need to prove intent, and you can be found guilty if you were only an accessory to the crime. And of course he talks about how racism impacts it, yada yada. I'm very tired of hearing about racism in the justice system, but I'm actually relatively receptive to hearing about the other parts of this issue. Quote, "I began to think that execution might even be preferable to spending your life behind bars," end quote. And just as a silly aside, a lot of my long-term subscribers have probably already heard my plan for prison reform. It is more cruel and unusual to deprive someone of freedom of movement and especially of family for multiple decades than it is to give them lashes on the back like they used to do in colonial days. The only thing is, if somebody gets a bloody back, that shocks the sensibilities. And so the bleeding hearts don't like it. They would rather, out of sight, out of mind, destroy someone's entire life by keeping them behind bars for decades and decades, rather than admitting that corporal punishment historically is a lot more normal than extremely long-term incarceration that we see today. But I digress. The reason I say this chapter is where we see who Fetterman is as a politician is because I don't think his philosophy on giving people second chances with pardons matches with the tattoos that he has on his arm. A reminder from the previous chapter, the tattoos are the dates of murders that happened during his time as mayor. More murders than you would think are committed by people reoffending, people who have already been convicted of a previous crime. So you either want to stop murders or you want to give people second chances. On the surface, this would seem pretty incongruous. And yes, I will bring up the murder of Irena Zarutska during this. The guy who stabbed her seemingly randomly on a public train, and then soon after started yelling some racial hatred. He had 14 prior arrests. Of course, he also had some mental problems. I read through a little bit of his arrest history. I think he should have been in a loony bin rather than in prison, if the system was functioning correctly. But that aside, looking at Fetterman's philosophy with this, I can see why it would seem incongruous to most people. I can see why it would not seem like hypocrisy to him in his own mind. Because, going back to that quote from Giselle that we stuck a pin in, quote, "This is the medium he found to do good. This was the conduit to do good. It just happened to be through politics." End quote. John Fetterman, I will remind you, is not a politician at heart. He is a non-profit worker who has found politics to be an effective method for doing the things he wants to do. If he got removed from the Senate tomorrow, I suspect he would go back to Braddock, with or without being mayor there, and continue to work on community centers. It just takes a certain type of person to dedicate their life to that kind of work. John and Giselle are that type of person. They are bleeding hearts, and I realize that term has some baggage with it. We don't necessarily have to consider that baggage when I use it in this context. What I mean is John has extreme sympathy for the people he sees right in front of his face. Whether those people be the family of a murder victim in Braddock where he was mayor, or whether those people be convicted felons who he thinks have been treated unfairly by the justice system. So if we as readers and we as voters and constituents are looking at this and thinking that the net number of murders is the thing that matters when we consider these two questions, then we're not really understanding John Fetterman. And in the same vein, going on to Chapter 8, the Shapiro affair, this chapter continues with the Board of Pardons stuff. Fetterman has a list of 15 specific cases that he supported for commuted sentences. Shapiro, on the Board of Pardons, votes against 12 out of 15 of those, including some he names by name in this book, the Horton brothers, who Fetterman calls ideal candidates for commutations. But Josh Shapiro continues to be stubborn and find various reasons to vote no on those. Fetterman and Shapiro have increasing ill will towards each other. There's even a hot mic moment where Fetterman calls Shapiro a fucking asshole, not realizing that the microphone is on and broadcasting publicly. Governor Tom Wolf at one point has to step in and attempt to mediate between these two. Eventually, Fetterman privately tells Shapiro that he, Fetterman, could either run for Senate in the next election, or he could run for governor and block Shapiro, who he knows intends to be governor. It all depends on Shapiro's vote for those 15 commutations. Fetterman apparently cares about this issue that much. After that private communication gets made, Shapiro ends up voting yes to most of the commutations, and Fetterman actually ends up hiring the Horton brothers to work on his Senate campaign. Second chances indeed. And the end of that chapter brings us up to the 2022 election, which, if you count 6 years back, this is 6 years from the 2016 election, the last time Fetterman tried to run for the U.S. Senate. He is going after the seat of Pat Toomey, who retired from the Senate in that year. Oh, the election stuff, by the way, is getting into Chapter 9, the worst day of my life. Fetterman declares his intent to run early on. He was still lieutenant governor at the time, and instantly after he declares his candidacy, the New York Times runs a hit piece about him. They, of course, twist the truth like the media do best, and tell a story about a time that Fetterman stopped a black man on the streets of Braddock and accused him of murder. Ooh, racist. Fetterman in the book, however, describes this day, that hit piece, as a milestone in his mental health decline, and he uses this chapter as an opportunity to tell his side of the story of what happened on that day. Multiple witnesses, including Fetterman, heard gunshots that night. Fetterman went outside to investigate because, of course, he's mayor. He feels like he has to participate in the law enforcement work. He sees a man jogging down the street wearing a ski mask. Because of the mask, and because it's at night, he doesn't even know the man's race. And the ski mask guy, after he gets brought into the police station, he says a lot of suspicious stuff and changes his story up about where he was that night. So overall, Fetterman seems to have been pretty justified in asking him questions. However, the year is 2022, we are sorta soon after the George Floyd death, and so if you're running in a Democrat Party primary, stuff like this matters. But all that to say, Fetterman knows what it's like to be blatantly lied about by the news. Damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of thing. He has experienced cancel culture. And as a matter of fact, even his alma mater, Albright College, cancels a commencement speech that he intended to give, probably because of that hit piece, but the official reason was something different. Connor Lamb was the official establishment choice, the official neoliberal choice for that primary election, but Lamb ended up getting humiliated at the polls. Fetterman won pretty handily. And now, Chapter 10, Are You Nuts? Fetterman describes working 20-hour days during the primary. He describes his health starting to slip. He describes his ankles swelling. He had a previous diagnosis for AFib, and he says that he was not exactly diligent in keeping up with the doctor's orders for that. Just days before the primary, John Fetterman's face begins to droop. Giselle sees it right away. She insists on taking him to the hospital immediately. Fetterman argues the entire way. During the car ride to the hospital, his speech begins to slur, and they spend a long time on the sidewalk in front of the hospital, trying to convince hospital staff that he is not competent, not legally able to make the decision to refuse healthcare treatment. Because Fetterman, of course, stubborn, doesn't want to go in, he wants to get to that campaign event that they're late for, insists that he's fine despite showing a lot of stroke symptoms. Ultimately, they have to play a little trick on Fetterman in order to get him inside the building. Chapter 11, Already Dead. Inside the hospital, there is a clot in his brain related to the AFib. He needs a pacemaker. He tells us he urinates 30 pounds of fluid. His heart stopped at one point during the surgery, and he describes having a near-death experience during that time. He wakes up with auditory processing issues. He can read, but he has trouble understanding speech. And now, that campaign team has the decision of what do they say to the media. They end up recording a video announcement of John Fetterman speaking from his hospital bed. They need to do several takes for that. They announce that he had a stroke from a clot related to the AFib. The media does their media thing, spins it every which way, badgers the doctors and the hospital to try and violate HIPAA. Fetterman actually ends up in surgery during the voting, and he ends up having to vote by emergency absentee ballot. Now that was the primary election, which Fetterman actually won despite the public knowing that he might not even survive to the general election. But of course he does survive, bringing us to Chapter 12, Troll Patrol. This general election pits a fake diet peddler versus a stroke victim in a purple bellwether state with 9-figure campaign budgets. What could go wrong? Fetterman ends up needing a closed caption device, which takes the form of an iPad that takes verbal speech and converts it to text on a screen. Oz beats Dave McCormick in the primary, which is kind of funny, because McCormick in 24 ended up winning the primary and the general election to become the other senator from Pennsylvania. But the Fetterman campaign wants to hit on neither of them living in Pennsylvania full-time. Mehmet Oz is a Turkish national. Quite literally, he has Turkish citizenship because he needs to visit his sick mother back in Turkey. And he promises, if he gets elected, he pretty please promises that he will renounce his dual citizenship. Oh boy. Now, Oz is actually a successful heart surgeon, and he does actually get a good amount of money from his TV show and from the products he sells. Myself, I do not think Oz should have run just because he's a dual citizen. Focus on your other endeavors. We do not need divided loyalty in the Senate. But Fetterman, of course, because he ran a campaign against Dr. Oz he knows inside and out, describes that Oz actually previously had a Senate hearing on his diet supplements being not what they're advertised to be, and that was 2014 when he had that hearing. Fetterman also tells us that Oz supports conversion therapy. I don't see why that's a bad thing, personally. Fetterman tells us Oz supported hydroxychloroquine, however you pronounce it, as a treatment for COVID, and in fact owns stock in that product, and lists off a lot of other things Oz has done, which Fetterman was able to use as fodder in that campaign. Quote, all this to say, how lucky was I? I can't help but wonder if I had run against any other candidate besides Dr. Oz, would I have lost? He got beaten by a guy recovering from a stroke." End quote. Now, back during the primary, Trump actually endorsed Oz over McCormick, which is what pushed Oz over the edge to win that primary. Oz ends up taking a vacation shortly after the primary. Fetterman, meanwhile, has some pre-recorded voiceover campaign ads from before he had the stroke, which is lucky for his campaign. A Fetterman campaign focus group surveyed a bunch of voters and found that Pennsylvanians do not like New Jersey. Wow, stunning. Never would have guessed. And so the campaign decided to highlight the carpetbagging aspect of Dr. Oz's campaign. Carpetbagging, for those who don't know, is running for office in a place where you're not local, which, me personally, I care about it a lot less than Oz's Turkish citizenship. Again, that really bothers me. But as far as Fetterman's campaign strategy goes, he goes for young staff who know how to use pop culture references. Quote, "I had hired them not because of traditional metrics an employer looks for, nor the contents of their resumes. Experience in politics was in some ways the least important criteria to me. The more experience you have, the more you rely on the tired and the cliché. I wanted people who were not only smart and dedicated, but also quirky and a little flawed." End quote. Henry Ford is echoing in my mind as I read that quote, as is Donald Trump's art of the deal. Experts are useless. Quote, "People who know what it was like to face adversity and claw their lives back, getting a few permanent scars along the way. People who led seamless lives were not interesting to me, probably because I had not led a seamless life." End quote. Fetterman gets a staff of those kind of people, also people who care about Pennsylvania. People who know the history of the steel economy and the rise of the unions. He nicknames his staff the Troll Patrol, because what they're going to do is troll Mehmet Oz. They troll him about spending time in Jersey. They actually contact some of the Jersey Shore celebrities, and you know that thing where you can pay a celebrity to read a pre-recorded line? They get Snooki to, unknowingly, record a gram to Dr. Oz. They also get Sopranos characters. They get evidence of Oz residing in New Jersey during the campaign. They get clips of Oz mispronouncing the names of towns in Pennsylvania, and doing touristy things that a local would know better. This one in particular hurts me. I had seen Oz's grocery store clip before, but when I was watching that, somehow it slipped my mind that he had mashed together the name of Redner's and Wegmans. Pennsylvanians will know. Now, reading this chapter, I think I was in an echo chamber during this election. I knew Oz wasn't the best, I didn't know he was that bad. But looking at it, stepping back and seeing the whole thing objectively, yeah, it makes sense, I get it now. Oz lost fair and square. And now, Chapter 13, The Siege. Fetterman keeps up with 538 polling. I wonder how that did him in the 2016 presidential election. Fetterman watches Oz's polling numbers rally and come back up. Fetterman actually started in the lead during that race. Republicans circle wagons behind Oz, and Fetterman starts getting personally hurt by the personal attacks during the campaign. On August 12th, he has a campaign event in Erie. This would be his first public appearance since the stroke. He displays speech capability. He displays that he can talk. But admittedly, he did rely on muscle memory to give that speech. Oz then, after this, challenges Fetterman to debates. Several debates, as a matter of fact. Fetterman agrees to one debate, and the number of attack ads increases. Fetterman lets criticism of him get into his head. There was a time they invited a reporter into Fetterman's home shortly before the debate to get a look at the closed caption device that he uses. The reporter does a bait and switch, and ends up running a negative news story on Fetterman after having cozied up to him enough to get inside that home. Quote, "Her behavior wasn't revelatory. I am not the first public figure to be fucked by a reporter, and I won't be the last. What was eye-opening was the window it gave to how people with disabilities navigate a world that doesn't give a shit." End quote. In the business, we call this foreshadowing. And Chapter 14, Good Night, Everybody. This chapter is about, of course, the debate. And the chapter title comes from his opening line during the debate, where he tried to say something like good evening, but it came out as good night used as a greeting. A rocky start. Quote, "I did not feel confident or assured because I wasn't." End quote. The debate was on October 25th in Harrisburg. It lasted 1 hour. Fetterman writes that it was a gamble. He wasn't a good debater even before the stroke, and this one would get especially a lot of attention because it's a Senate election in a very contentious state, and because, of course, the stroke drummed up a lot of public attention. They did practice debates, of course. He got, well, as good as he could get. They arranged to have a professional stenographer, and Dr. Oz agreed to this, provide closed captioning during the debate, but last minute apparently there was some mix-up, and the person who was supposed to do that got switched out, but the Fetterman campaign decides to still go ahead with it. Oz does waffle once or twice, but ultimately it gets really overshadowed by Fetterman just crashing and burning and having to rely on those muscle memory lines. It was clear he wasn't doing well, but it was also clear he was doing the best that he could. And this is coming from someone who, at the time, I did hold my nose and vote Oz over a stroke victim. Yes, Fetterman's willingness to go ahead with this debate and just power through it, despite all the setbacks, is admirable. It was not a good look for Oz to focus on the stroke the way that he did. If he focused on competence to do the job and just left it at that, it would have been a much better message. But I think the subtle hostility of drumming up that you have a brain-damaged opponent in this election actually worked against him and ended up having voters have some more sympathy for him than they would have. And after the election, I do have fewer concerns about Fetterman's ability to do the job than I did at the time. Which brings us to Chapter 15, Turn Out the Lights. Quote, shooting myself up with the shame that is too often the sustenance of the depressible. We seek self-flagellation, end quote. Quote, it was like I had two voices in my head, one that was sane, and one in which the depression did the talking, end quote. I think even some of the best of us would have vulnerable moments after crashing out that much in an event that big, even when everybody knew ahead of time it wasn't necessarily going to be pretty. I think the performance did end up a little worse than everyone on Fetterman's team was even expecting. Quote, my depression was beside itself with joy, end quote. Who here has listened to my Lucerne book review? Fetterman describes himself compulsively checking Twitter immediately after the debate for reactions, which obviously weren't going to be good. All the talking heads, all the news anchors were asking if Fetterman was fit to serve in office. And during that drive home to Braddock from Harrisburg after the debate, in the middle of the night they stop at a Sheetz gas station. And Fetterman's mindset gets to the point where the people on his campaign staff talk amongst themselves and agree that somebody is going to go in before him and scout out if the gas station happens to have the news on a TV inside the building, because they want to avoid Fetterman seeing that in public. And I think this is a good place in the narrative to stop and highlight something I noticed in this book. Quote, you don't control John, end quote. That is an idea that comes up repeatedly, again and again in this book. Temper was the first word that came to my mind, but maybe that's not exactly the right word for this. He doesn't describe himself getting angry enough to throw things, but let's call it an extreme stubborn streak, to say the least. When he makes up his mind and gets adamant about something, even his entire campaign staff and family all together trying to talk him out of it probably is not going to work. One example, when his entire campaign staff and family, even his parents, came out, were all together telling him, you are having a stroke, your face is drooping, you are slurring your speech. Here, I just recorded this video of you slurring your speech 10 seconds ago, watch this, you are slurring your speech, you're having a stroke, go to the hospital. Even in that situation, he was stubborn enough to say, no, we're late to this campaign event, let's go to the campaign event. And on the one hand, we can read this as him having a pretty serious flaw in that regard, but on the other hand, he's writing candidly about it, which that level of self-awareness itself is a good sign on his part. The thing I will interject about it, though, comes from a Christian perspective. Self-control is one of the fruits of the Spirit, and really, that's one of the best ways that Christianity allows people to change themselves. It's a tool for giving people a greater mastery over bad habits or addictions that they consciously want to kick, but that instant gratification part of the brain makes it super hard to just see something and avoid it altogether. So, on the off chance that John Fetterman is listening to this, on the off chance that a couple years after this book, he is still struggling with that particular problem, on the off chance that he would like to improve in that regard, may I recommend Jesus Christ. But back to the narrative. Quote, voters were not listening to the media. People understood. When I asked at events how many of them knew someone who had a stroke, hands shot up. They knew recovery did not happen overnight. In looking at me, they saw someone who had done the best he could under impossible circumstances. They did not see someone who did not have the ability to serve. They saw someone who was brave, end quote. After that debate, actually defying all expectations, Fetterman had a fundraising boost. Quote, by January, I'm going to be feeling even better, but Oz will still be a fraud, end quote. Despite the fundraising boost, the polls do narrow. which often happens as we get closer to election day in any election. It appears as if the candidates are more neck and neck than they sometimes actually are. Quote, I realize that the media has no finger on the pulse of an election. They live inside the circle jerk. What they care about is the opposite of what voters care about, end quote. And that ability of the Fetterman campaign to have their finger on the pulse more than the media is an impressive thing, and it's something I remark upon sometimes. So many people, even people I talk to on a regular basis, live on Twitter. They imagine Twitter to be a representative sample of American voters. But here's the thing, how often do we see a post, any post, even an Elon Musk post that has 7 figures of hearts, that has at least 1 million people that liked that post? No, most often from the big accounts you get 5 figures of hearts, since in the tens of thousands. Once in a while you see hundreds of thousands of people liking a single post. Now consider that scale of numbers, and then consider there are hundreds of millions of American voters. The people who pay super close attention to the news and Twitter, even to talking heads on the cable news stations, even to alternative media like Joe Rogan, Tim Pool, that proportion of people is much smaller than the people in those circles like to imagine. We are not a representative sample of the American voting public. We are a small subset of it. Can we call ourselves more informed and act high and mighty? Well, I mean, we certainly can. But we should also keep in mind that this level of paying attention, monitoring the situation, I'll use that meme, the amount of time invested in keeping up with politics and current events, also does something to our mindset, and on some level we would probably be better served by ditching Twitter, ditching news, ditching the apps, and just focusing more on the people we see in person, face-to-face, on a daily basis. For hundreds of years, people got their political discussion from newspapers at best, but mostly from talking to people who they see face-to-face every day. That is a healthy way for a human being to operate. Is it healthy for the civic structure? Who knows? But in terms of not being screen-addicted gremlins, yes, we should be talking to people who are local to us more often than we use Twitter. Hey, that was a tangent. Back to recounting Fett's story of this election. 4 days before voting day, Oprah Winfrey endorses John Fetterman. Now, most endorsements in elections don't matter much. Even Fetterman himself writes that in his book. But this particular endorsement, because Oprah had appeared on TV alongside Dr. Oz so many times, this endorsement probably did make a difference. And the other October surprise they got was a claim that Dr. Oz had done medical experimentation on dogs. Everybody loves puppies. And just on a personal note, I don't get why when stuff like this comes out, it's as big a deal as it is. People who work in medicine or psychology have probably done live rat experiments, and I wouldn't put it past them to have done other live animal experiments on different types of animals. It's not pretty, it's not nice when it's talked about, but that's just the way it is. That is why medicine and science are in the place where they are today. Millions of successful medical operations have been done because of the knowledge that doctors gained by digging up the corpses of dead people and dissecting them against the family's wishes more recently than we would like to believe. That is just the story of how medicine developed. That is just how it is. Someone had to have gotten that knowledge somewhere in order to write those textbooks. That's just my 2 cents, but regardless, this was an October surprise that was not good for the Dr. Oz campaign. And despite everybody close to the Fetterman campaign absolutely panicking, Fetterman ended up beating Dr. Oz by around 5 points, which, considering Oz lost to a literal stroke victim, is really impressive. He did really well. However, back to the book, quote, none of this made any difference to me or my depression. According to my depression, I was an imposter, a fake, a fraud. Better to have stayed in Braddock, working with kids, than presuming I could be a U.S. Senator. I didn't deserve to be one. I didn't deserve a beautiful family, or a campaign staff that had worked their butts off. I didn't deserve anything except loneliness and sadness and isolation." End quote. A nice reminder that this book is more about his mental health journey than it is about the stroke itself. Coming to Chapter 16, Election Blues. Fetterman actually has to be talked into attending election night events. Going into election night, he is that fearful and that assured, I guess would be the word, of his own failure in the election. Quote, "Then I returned to my bed. It had become my only safe harbor, the only place where the voices of depression didn't rattle in my brain." End quote. When he needs to, he is able to put on a good face for the public, but he does not want to, and it is a big effort to get him to come out to public events. His family and his staff have to expend a lot of energy getting him to go places. Quote, "Everyone was frazzled, hammered to the bone. They too just wanted it to end, to not have to take care of me anymore." End quote. Chapter 17, The Crack-Up. Dr. Oz calling to concede the election to the Fetterman team was the first time Fetterman actually let himself believe that he won. And then, quote, "I returned to bed and largely stayed there for the rest of November and December until I was sworn in early January. I still did not know the depths of my depression, nor did I really know the impact it was having on those around me." End quote. He has suicidal thoughts during this time. He wants to just disappear. He describes his kids feeling guilt, wondering if they were at least partially responsible for how their father was feeling and acting. People on his staff tell him to seek out therapy, but John is stubborn. Buying a suit for the swearing-in ceremony feels like an insurmountable task. He even had to be talked into going to that ceremony itself. Quote, "In my head, every positive had become a negative. I felt like a child, unable to do anything on my own, filled with fear. I felt embarrassed to be so helpless. But the mental beating from depression had worn me down to nothing." End quote. Quote, "We spoke, my father in his early 70s actually having to coax me into going to something that represented the crowning achievement of my life." End quote. Quote, "Giselle no longer recognized who I was. I didn't either, which is why I didn't want to go." End quote. And during this time, social media making memes about him certainly did not help. He describes a sort of paranoia. Someone would ask him, "How's it going?" And his response would be, "Why do you ask?" He gets absorbed into what people online say about him, and hyperfixates on the negative. During this time, there was also a minor scandal. Sam Bankman-Fried, if you remember him. This is really a nothing burger. But that's the guy who got arrested for massive amounts of money laundering and campaign donations. He was in the news for about 5 minutes total, and then he got sent to the same prison as Diddy and Ghislaine Maxwell and Nicolas Maduro. Sounds like the intro to a good joke. Diddy and Maduro walk into a bar. But anyway, Sam Bankman-Fried back in the day apparently donated the maximum individual contribution to the Fetterman campaign. That is $2,500. Big whoop. In the big picture, this does not matter at all. But in Fetterman's mind, this gets blown out of proportion. The time to start serving in the Senate comes around. He moves to D.C., gets a super crummy apartment. However, he lived in that church basement in Braddock, so he knows how to live in a crummy apartment. Quote, "It was in the building's basement. No windows, no light. The only food I kept there was dried seaweed. When I returned each night around 5 p.m., I'd lock the door, lie on the mattress on the floor, and welcome the dark. In the morning, I'd wait until the last minute to get dressed. I had no clothes except for the one suit I wore every day. Outside of going to do work and coming home again, I didn't have any routine. I had stopped listening to music long ago. I wasn't even getting coffee in the morning." End quote. He describes the first classified Senate briefing he was at, the iPad that has the closed captioning on it. For whatever reason, he couldn't understand, couldn't follow the conversation, and he just left after 20 minutes. Quote, "My only comfort as I left the room was that Governor Shapiro would appoint a Democrat to replace me if I resigned." End quote. He skips meals, he dodges events and appearances any chance he can get. His staff have to absolutely nanny him. One day, John Fetterman leaves the Senate, wanders around D.C., walks around the city, sends Giselle an incoherent text. His staff go out searching for him, they find him, and they take him to a hospital. Turns out it was actually related to the stroke. They found, in fact, he had no new stroke, but something definitely wasn't right, according to the doctors. He ends up going back to his parents' house in York, Pennsylvania. The doctors prescribe him medication, and one of his staff members has to drive him to and from D.C. on a regular basis. But that is just not a sustainable arrangement. Chapter 18, Coming to Get Me. John now describes the famous stay in Walter Reed, the one that made the rounds on social media. He describes being paranoid in the lead-up to his going in there. Among other things, paranoid about being followed by his own staff. Describes doing figure-8 patterns in the hallway to avoid being followed. Ultimately, though, the staff do talk him into going in there. Quote, "The part of John that wanted to die was telling him not to go. He overcame that part and moved." End quote. At 5 p.m. on February 15th of 2023, he checks in. Quote, "I was convinced I was being checked into a loony bin and might never see my family again." End quote. He was diagnosed with severe depression, low blood pressure from his bad diet, and his heart medication was a complicating factor. Quote, "I was there and I would be there indefinitely. I wondered if they would ever let me out, end quote. And inevitably they had to announce this to the press and the public. Chapter 19, You Are Loved. His son's birthday actually happens to be the day that he gets checked in, and when they come back from the son's birthday dinner, the news vans actually show up at their house in Braddock to ask the family questions. The family ends up going away to Niagara Falls for a couple days, and they ended up making the best of it. Quote, "This is like a celebrity trip because getting help is really brave, and we should ask for help. Your dad has a lot of courage," end quote. And then, of course, the kids end up dreading school because of the publicity. Quote, "The media did show surprising respect to me for what I was going through. They even showed some sympathy, just not for my family," end quote. And there is some resentment there about how the family was treated. Now, during his time in Walter Reed, Fetterman was cut off from technology. That's one of the things they do for mental health cases. So he wasn't getting a lot of news from the outside world except from visitors, which were limited. His family actually had not visited for a while he was there. Quote, "I was terrified of seeing them to the extent that I could not bring myself to see them at all," end quote. He describes briefly seeing a news story about them in Niagara and worrying that his wife left with the kids to go to Brazil. Describes a Twitter poll from Matt Walsh, that's the What is a Woman guy, about who is the worst wife in America, making fun of Giselle. Quote, "My admission to Walter Reed had become a national story. The assumption from the news media was that I was in the psychiatric unit. I wasn't. I was in the traumatic brain injury unit for symptoms related to the stroke under the care of Dr. Williamson, who was also my psychiatrist," end quote. Kind of a weird distinction there. Quote, "I wanted to convey the message that there was no shame in having a mental health struggle, only in not doing anything about it," end quote. The days tick by. Fox News runs a story that Giselle and Jill Biden should be ashamed for putting their husbands out there. Meanwhile, John gets a book, Understanding Depression, from Giselle, which is one of the most well-known books for dealing with depression. Quote, "It took several weeks before I began to improve. I felt more alive and animated than I had in months. I was present instead of being in a stupor. I had energy. I realized depression is treatable," end quote. And then he begins to catch up on news from the Senate. Quote, "There were still enormous challenges, though. I was still terrified to see my family," end quote. It is only towards the tail end of his stay that they decide it's time for his family to come in to visit, and they obviously want to visit, despite the fact it's a considerable drive from western Pennsylvania all the way to Washington, D.C. Fetterman describes a conversation with one therapist in particular. He said something along the lines of, quote, "I think the kids are better off without me," end quote. And the therapist's response was, "Children need their daddy." And that phrase became one that he latched onto, turned into sort of a personal mantra for him. That responsibility of being there for his kids is something that motivated him. Quote, "Things Giselle had said had hurt me, just as my constant refusal to seek help had driven her crazy. There was trauma in the marriage, the kind of trauma that is inevitable when husband and wife are living through a catastrophe with no clear end," end quote. And these kind of nervous thoughts are his mindset leading up to his family's visit. When they do come, though, the kids deliver handfuls of positive affirmations sticky notes. The hospital staff apparently told them that would be helpful. Quote, "The best antidote to depression is love, the only emotion it cannot screw with," end quote. And chapter 20, still here. He was released on March 21st. They say that his depression is in remission. He feels better, but he did still have the hearing problems at that point. Quote, "Depression is an illness. If you try to mask your mental health issues, if you think they'll just go away, I can guarantee that they won't. I tried that with mine, and it only got worse for myself and everyone around me," end quote. And quote from Giselle, quote, "It makes everyone around you feel that they are responsible for your happiness, and that's really cruel," end quote. So now, with the narrative part of the book out of the way, he turns to some political musings. Quote, "Legislation is a group effort. Loners in the Senate are exactly that, loners," end quote. He describes the Senate being generally supportive of him for his mental health struggle, even some people on the other side of the aisle. However, within a few months of his release from Walter Reed, his father ends up in the hospital with heart disease and makes a miracle recovery. Fetterman goes back to the Senate. He makes it up to his son for missing his birthday. In the time current to him writing the book, 2025, he says that he is able to avoid reading news about himself for the most part. He says he was warned against going public with his mental health story, but he went ahead and published this whole book anyway. Quote, "I think I am most disappointed at the damage that has been done to openness about mental health issues. I fear that after other public figures see how my mental health crisis has been weaponized against me, no one will ever be open again. I hope that's not the case," end quote. And about some of the people who ran the news stories, quote, "It's troubling when you have this kind of betrayal from people you trust and have been decent to," end quote. And a particularly spicy quote, quote, "I've drank deeply from the venom of both the left and the right. and as a connoisseur, I can confirm that the most poisonous, the bitterest, is from the far left. The right tells me I suck and calls me names. The far left calls for my death." End quote. Lest we forget who killed Charlie Kirk and who gave Trump an ear piercing, and for that matter, who killed the Romanovs and the Kulaks, because it really does go back that far and a lot further. So, acknowledging how much support he's losing from his own party, I get the impression from this book that he has always been as far left as he is, but the voter base there is simply fickle and very unforgiving. Moving on, after the Walter Reed stay, he still uses an iPad for the closed caption during conversations. I wonder, and I actually included this in the letter that I sent him letting him know I'm recording this book review, I have to wonder if he's tried sign language. Just interesting for me to think about, because I get the impression that is a different part of the brain than the part that handles verbal speech. I'll have to look that up because I'm sure that's actually been tested. But regardless, I told him, and I will tell you, I would be very happy if K-12 public schools added sign language to the curriculum. Our high schools teach foreign languages as a requirement for graduating, and most students completely forget what they learned. However, apart from Spanish, I believe sign language is more likely to have applicable uses in day-to-day life. I think we would serve our students well by at least teaching them the basics of that. Stuff happens, strokes like Fetterman had happen, meeting deaf people out in the world happens. Even just going to a concert or walking through a factory floor, going into a high-noise place that it's hard to hear in. Stuff like that happens, and if the average American were equipped with at least a basic knowledge of signing, that would make communication a lot easier. But back to the book. Quote, "I don't take positions for my own self-interest. I take positions because of what I believe is right." End quote. I absolutely believe him when he says that. For better or worse, by the way. He describes being at peace with his views on Israel, losing him all the support from his base. He does support immigration, obviously, look who he married, but is actually reasonable about it. He sees the right's point when we say that open borders, endless migration is crazy and unsustainable. He does butt up against President Biden with that. Fetterman writes that he wants Democrats to reach out and work with Republicans for the good of their constituents. And I don't know, maybe that's a Pennsylvania thing, that's my home state as well. Myself and regular everyday people who I talk to around me want to see the two sides reconciled to each other. Torn friendships, torn family connections rebuilt, because let's be honest, the past decade has been horrible for that. And even the other U.S. senator from my state, newly elected Republican, has been buddy-buddy with Fetterman in the news, both of them talking about crossing the aisle and actually having real conversations with the other side. I like to see that quite a bit. Quote, "Somehow the Democrat Party has lost the support of the regular Joes that had once been its backbone. We became the party of the elites, one that had lost touch with its base." End quote. Which is sorta where I was thinking Fetterman landed all along. His loyalties are to Union Democrats. He is of them, he is for them. He has some progressive views, but he is not out and out a progressive. His Hail Mary redemption arc in politics probably looks something like the Union Democrats winning this Democrat Party civil war against the progressives understanding that they need to go to the Green Party or something, and the Democrat Party reshaping itself, the entire structure of itself, in a way that can appeal to a lot of the Union voters that they lost in 2016, 2020, 2024, a lot of those blue-collar voters that had been Democrat but they voted for Trump 3 times. That's just what I think. Quote, "In the aftermath of the Trump win, I'm not sure anyone knows what the Democrat Party is anymore. We need to get away from the progressive and liberal notion that everything the Democrats do is right and above reproach, and everything the Republicans do is wrong and evil. We need to start talking to one another. Without this kind of communication, we are truly sunk." End quote. And on that note, Fetterman describes meeting with Donald Trump, describes them having a near-death experience in common, which I hadn't thought of before reading this, describes finding at least some areas of common ground, and he ends this chapter by having a call out to leftists to win elections in a sane way, rather than obstructing and calling Trump a king, and just name-calling everywhere, and generally acting like children. Epilogue, A Single Rose. This chapter sums up the core message of the book, which is about destigmatizing mental health struggles, especially with prominent public figures, and encouraging people to seek help if they struggle with that. Describes someone he knew, his name is Blake, fellow stroke survivor. He did have political disagreements with Fetterman, but he ended up getting depression and likely committed suicide. Fetterman says to seek help, remember you have loved ones, and don't be afraid of medication. Quote, those most affected by suicide are the ones you leave behind, end quote. Quote, when you die, even for a few seconds, and are brought back to life like I was, you realize the preciousness of life, and even more, what matters and what doesn't matter. Just because it's a cliche doesn't make it any less true, end quote. Quote, ironically, it took me dying to feel better, end quote. And to add to the oomph of this message, the epilogue is the second chapter that Fetterman himself recorded, and listening to the audiobook, he actually did cry while recording that. Quote, when I came home from that long stay at the hospital, I looked around at my possessions and clothes, and I imagined myself observing as a spirit that had left and thinking about how my family would live their lives and never see me again, end quote. And ends off by describing a visit he took in 2025 to his friend Eric's grave. Remember Eric from Connecticut? 32 years on from his death, he leaves a single rose at that gravestone. Quote, I've lived 32 years that Eric never had. I will never forget that, just as I will never forget that it was because of Eric's death that my life really began. That serendipitous arc, end quote. Remember that death was the push he needed to leave a dead-end job and do something he wanted to do, even if it was less financially stable at the beginning. Quote, I find the simple pleasures in life the most rewarding. One is being with my family, another is coffee. And that is the end of what he wrote. Now, my own feelings around mental health care were a little bit complicated going into this book. I knew that I would have to address that in some way. So here's just some miscellaneous thoughts I wrote down at the beginning. I do not trust SSRIs. Fetterman has not convinced me otherwise. I have read some research, admittedly a few years ago, I should read something more recent on that the role of serotonin in the brain may not be exactly what we thought it was at the time that that kind of depression medication was produced. And in addition, I am deeply suspicious that those type of pills can cause neuroreceptor burnout, just like a lot of the hard drugs do, as far as knowing how to deal with the type of mental state that comes from deep struggles in life. Well, what do you think my answer is going to be? Tolstoy, C.S. Lewis. A rule of thumb I have is if I take advice from someone, make it someone whose life I want to emulate. So find someone who's older, has a lot more life experience, someone whose life I want my life to look like when I'm their age. And that will most often be a happily married old man from my church. But also there's a lot to be said for just self-discipline. Contrast the attitude towards one's own mental state displayed in this book, contrast it with Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance. Yeah, life is hard. Yeah, you're in a tough situation. Yeah, you might feel terrible. Doesn't matter, the world does not care about your feelings. J.D. Vance's answer is to take a Marine Corps attitude and do what needs to be done. And that is why I think the best place for J.D. Vance is an executive role. And I think probably the best place for John Fetterman is doing nonprofit work back in Braddock. I'm reminded of the South Park episode with that strip mall dojo, Discipline. Now, I do also want to address what Fetterman might have been thinking from a pragmatic perspective when he wrote and made the decision to go ahead and publish this book. The PR from his Walter Reed stay was admittedly pretty bad, and this book just aggressively opening up, laying it all bare, is a great strategy for turning that PR around. At the very least, it worked on me. I am more willing than I was going into this book to listen to Fetterman and take him seriously. However, his stance on Israel has overshadowed that, and overshadowed any support he might have picked up from people reading this book. One thing I noticed from reading this and I wanted to comment on, I did not know that Giselle was an immigrant. I had seen pictures of the family together before, but I had not known much anything about her. Just looking at her without knowing anything about her, I would have guessed she was like a Joan Jett biker chick, which fits pretty well with Fetterman's look, bald with arm tattoos. Like he said in the chapter 1 of this book, he looks like a skinhead. But knowing she's from South America makes me take a step back and reevaluate, because looks can be deceiving and fashion can be deceiving. Someone who dresses a certain way in New England, or in Pennsylvania, or in the South, there might be a bad stigma attached to that. But someone who dresses the same way somewhere in South America, the culture is different with that kind of thing, and making those kind of judgments can be deceiving. The other thing I wanted to note about her is that she has been relatively less visible than other political wives I've seen. Contrast with Melania Trump, she is visible, she does do things. It took a little while for her to get out of her shell, and even now she's cautious about the things she does. I've seen her do diplomacy with Putin about returning Russian and Ukrainian orphans, respectively, to their families on the other side of the battle line. And of course, the drama about the White House Christmas decorations. Things that, like, she's going into it hoping not to get attention for it. Both, I think, for the sake of her son Barron, as well as for her own sanity. No matter what outfit she chooses for any big public appearance, there will probably be news stories about it. I do do not envy that position. But contrast both of those with Michelle Obama, very visible. Joe Biden, just because of how Joe was during his term, I think she couldn't really avoid being visible. But apart from that, Joe had been a senator for several decades, so she by now is used to the political world, and it wouldn't have been as big a culture shock transition when Joe actually won the election. Another one, Usha Vance, in a way, it's hard to avoid her getting a lot of attention just because she's Indian, let's put it out there. Elephant in the room, people bring it up frequently. I still like JD quite a bit, I don't care. But then also contrasting Giselle with the other relatively new wife of a U.S. Senator from Pennsylvania, that would be Dina McCormick, which, as far as I can tell, she hasn't been purposely in the limelight. However, just comparing how much the average voter knows about the candidate's spouse's background, I had heard word of mouth, and I hadn't read McCormick's book yet, this was even back during the election, that McCormick's wife was actually Coptic Christian, and indeed, looking this up on Wikipedia, she was apparently born in Cairo, Egypt, so that seems to be actually the case. But even just voters knowing that little detail, contrasting it with me having had no idea that someone I've seen a picture of, the spouse of a high-profile person I could have voted for, was born in a place like Brazil, and I had no clue about that. So in that way, I think it breaks the mold a little bit how private Giselle is, at least about her personal details and the personal family life. But going back to her quote in Chapter 6, quote, "It's not a sacrifice I wanted to make," end quote. Quote, "This is the medium he found to do good. This was the conduit to do good. And it just happened to be through politics," end quote. Which is a great transition. I wanted to talk about that quote in particular. I think I did already talk about this at least a little during his chapter about the pardons, but reading through this book, I can absolutely see that John Fetterman is a nonprofit worker at heart, and it just takes a certain type of person to dedicate your life to that field of work, and I see Fetterman's political career as an extension of his nonprofit work. I think he is genuine when he says that Eric's death affected him in that way. I think he is genuine when he says he is really trying to do good in the Senate, even if I disagree with him on a lot of things. I think he is genuine about most of the political stances he takes. Him talking about mental health is not pragmatic, or at least part of it might be pragmatic. His stance on Israel is certainly not pragmatic. A lot of things he says, you can tell that he's saying it with his whole heart and that he believes it. I also wanted to talk about the concept of suicide while I'm at this. Suicide is greedy. It is not artistic, surreal, not filled with deep meaning or anything like that. Suicide is willfully, knowingly sacrificing the happiness of everyone around you who will be filled with grief at knowing what you did, in favor of your own comfort and stopping whatever pain you're feeling, even at the cost of all the rest of the time that you might have had on this earth. Murder is bad because when you kill someone, you're robbing them of the chance to have a relationship with God for however many years they might have had left. Suicide is bad because you're robbing yourself of the same thing, and because you're failing to serve others. Hi, hello, nice to meet you. I'm Christian. I'm sure you knew that already. I like Jesus and I like talking about God. The greatest commandment God gives us, Matthew chapter 22, it is twofold: to love God and love others. We love God by serving God, we love others by serving others, putting their needs and even their comfort above our own. Even, Matthew chapter 5, even people who hate us and want to hurt us. Did anyone here listen to my Fall of Western Man book review? What good is having a fancy car if you don't have anyone to share a joyride with? I think it was Michael Knowles say the other day, I forget who he was quoting, I think this was a quote, "Hell is a place where you have nothing to do except amuse yourself." Humans are social creatures. We have a deep psychological need for social interaction. And if we don't get positive interactions, then the fanciest car, the best food, all the best accommodations in the world will feel empty. Who knows the Old Testament of the Bible? Ecclesiastes, vanity. All the pursuits outside of God are nothing. And going back to the greatest commandment, it is twofold: love God and love others, because those are one in the same. We serve God by serving others. And when we form close symbiotic relationships with other people in our lives, not meeting our own needs and comforts, but instead meeting each other's needs and comforts, whenever that works out, that leads to more happiness, more deep spiritual fulfillment than we ever could have done by ourselves. Now, in that light, think about choosing to give everyone around us the grief of having a loved one suddenly die. That is why serving your own comfort in that way, rather than concerning yourself with the comfort of people around you is one of the most immoral things that someone can do. And even bringing it back to that children need their daddy line, the human need to serve others goes deep enough that this, rather than anything else from Walter Reed, was the thing that resonated with John Fetterman. But enough preaching for one day. I want to wrap up this book review by posing a question. Is there room in the Democrat Party for someone who married an immigrant, someone who poured a lot of time and energy into building community centers in a black neighborhood, someone who supports prison reform and is very generous handing out paroles and pardons, someone who is fine with immigration but just recognizes that we need a reasonable limit on it? Is there room in the Democrat Party for that person if that person is also vocal about supporting Israel? Well, looking at Fetterman's approval numbers, the answer seems to be no. Now, I struggle to care about Israel either way. I struggle to find a reason why a country 2 continents away should be supporting either side, Israel or Palestine. I'm concerned about this question because John Fetterman does stand for that Union Democrat faction of the party, which is in general a lot more sane than the out-and-out progressives. I care about John Fetterman's of the Democrat Party existing at all, because, looking at the Republican Party, what happens if the moral police win out against the libertarians, and all of a sudden we get internet ID, age verification everywhere, and we get violations of the First Amendment left and right? What happens if and when we have that situation, if the Democrats, meanwhile, are too busy talking about trans bathrooms being a human right to actually put up any meaningful opposition to that? Who do I vote for at that point? The answer is I would be without a political home because I have a deep libertarian streak in me. Trump derangement syndrome is real. Trump has absolutely turned the entire left wing insane. And that is not necessarily a good thing. If you are fully 100% Republican, then that's a good thing. But if you want the country to do well, if you want the best opinions in the marketplace of ideas to come to the surface, then having only one political party that's able to be taken seriously, because the other party can't get past Orange Man bad, then it becomes a disaster that we have so few politicians like John Fetterman who are willing to have meetings and try to find places they can relate to people they disagree with. But no, instead we get left-wing political assassins on a fairly regular basis, and we get trans high school shooters every year or so. Whoopee.